There is a hole in the ground in eastern Oregon that almost nobody has ever walked into. It sits in Harney County, about 25 miles from the nearest town, in country so empty that the road to it does not appear on most maps as anything more than a gray line. From the surface it looks like a collapse, a dip in the sagebrush, broken basalt, a slot of shadow, and then nothing. Go inside and the passage runs for more than half a mile straight into the rock. And at the far end of it, in total darkness, there is a lake. For as long as anyone has been keeping records, that lake has filled the back of the cave and stopped everyone who ever came to look. Archaeologists reached it and turned around. Surveyors reached it and turned around. Whatever the floor of that cave looked like past the water, no living person had seen it. The water is dropping now. Not because of a season, not because of a dry summer. It is dropping because of something happening in the rock underneath all of Harney County, and it has been dropping, measurably, for years. And as it goes down, it is uncovering ground that has been sealed under cold water since before the United States existed. What is being exposed down there is not a body. It is not a monster. It is not the massacre the Paiute have described for 200 years, though we are going to get to that, because that story matters more than you think. It is quieter than any of those things. It is also older. Old enough that if the numbers hold, they contradict something you were taught in school as settled fact. And once you understand what that cave has been holding, you will not be able to look at a hole in the ground in the American West the same way again. To understand why this particular cave matters, you have to understand that it is not really a cave. It is a pipe. Somewhere between 15 and 20,000 years ago, in a volcanic field to the west called Diamond Craters, basalt came out of the ground. Not the explosive kind, the slow kind, a flood of molten rock moving downhill at the pace of a walking man. The outside of that flow hit the cold desert air and hardened into a crust. The inside stayed liquid and kept moving. And when the eruption finally stopped, the liquid core drained out from under the hardened shell and left the shell behind, an empty tube, sealed on all sides by a foot of solid basalt. That is Malheur Cave, around 3,000 feet of it, running nearly level into the rock, tall enough at the mouth to drive a truck through and narrowing as it goes. Here is what makes a lava tube different from a limestone cave, and it is the single most important fact in this entire story. Limestone caves are alive. They are wet, they are chemically active. Water moves through them constantly, dissolving and redepositing rock. Things left in a limestone cave get coated, dissolved, buried, or eaten. A lava tube does none of that. Basalt is inert. Nothing dissolves, nothing seeps. There is one entrance, one air path, and no weather. Which means the inside of Malheur Cave is not a place. It is a condition. The temperature holds within a few degrees, year-round, regardless of what the desert is doing on the surface. In August, when the ground above hits triple digits and the air shimmers over the sagebrush, the back of that cave is cold. In January, when the high desert drops well below freezing and the wind comes across the Harney Basin with nothing to stop it, the back of that cave is exactly as cold as it was in August. No sunlight has ever reached the far end. No ultraviolet, no plants, no roots, no burrowing animals, almost no insects. The bacterial load in the deep passage is a fraction of what exists in a spoonful of ordinary soil, because bacteria need food, and there is nothing down there to eat. Now add the water. The rear portion of the cave is flooded. Cold, clear, still. Water that has no current, no oxygen exchange to speak of, and no light. Put an object in dirt, and it has maybe a decade before the soil chemistry starts taking it apart. Put an object in a lake and you have got fish, bacteria, and dissolved oxygen working on it from the first hour. Put an object under cold, still water inside a sealed basalt tube, and none of that happens. The clock does not slow down. The clock stops. Textiles that would turn to nothing in a graveyard in 50 years survive intact. Plant fiber, cordage, wood, bone with the collagen still in it, material that carries a date, if you can get it into a lab before the air gets to it. Archaeologists have a word for a site like this. They call it a preservation environment, and they say it the way a doctor says a rare blood type, carefully, and with the understanding that you may only ever see one. There are a handful of them in North America. Malheur is one. And for the entire span of modern American archaeology, the best preserved part of it has been underwater and out of reach. That is not a gap in the record. That is a locked room. Now here is the part that changes the temperature of this whole story. That locked room is not empty, and we know it is not empty, because people have been going into Malheur Cave for a very long time. Not visiting, using. The Harney Basin has been continuously occupied for thousands of years. This was northern Paiute country, the Watatika, the Wata seed eaters, named for the plant they harvested out of the marshes around Malheur Lake. They moved in a seasonal round across a landscape that most modern Americans would call empty, and that they knew the way you know your own house. And in a country where summer will kill you with heat and winter will kill you with cold, a sealed basalt tube that holds one temperature year-round with clean water at the back of it is not a curiosity. It is infrastructure. There is also a story attached to it. It has been told for generations, and it is the reason a lot of people know the name Malheur Cave at all. The story is that a band took shelter in that cave during a conflict. One account has them driven in by enemy raiders, and the details vary depending on who is telling it and when. What does not vary is the ending. They went into the cave, and the people outside knew exactly what a cave with one entrance actually is. A shelter and a trap are the same architecture. The only difference is who is standing at the mouth. The story says that almost none of them came out. I want to be careful with this, because it matters. That is oral tradition. It is not a police report, and it should not be treated as one. It has been recorded by outsiders in several versions across more than a century, and the versions do not perfectly agree. But oral tradition in the Great Basin has a track record that a lot of people underestimate. Traditions in this region have described landscape events, floods, eruptions, lakes that existed and then did not, that geologists later confirmed happened, thousands of years before the confirmation. So the honest position is not, it is a myth. The honest position is, there is a specific account, tied to a specific place, describing a specific event, and the floor of that place has never been fully examined. Then comes the 20th century, and Malheur Cave gets stranger. In the 1930s, the cave was acquired by the Grand Lodge of Ancient Free and Accepted Masons of Oregon, the Freemasons. They have owned it ever since. That is not a rumor, it is a property record. And they use it. For decades, the Oregon Masons have held ceremonies inside that cave, lodge meetings conducted underground, in a lava tube in the middle of the high desert, in a chamber with a black lake at the end of it. Whatever you think about that, understand what it did practically. It made Malheur Cave private property. Not a park, not a monument, not federal land with a management plan and a public comment period and a survey requirement. Private land, gated, entered by permission, on a ranch road 24 miles from town in the emptiest county in Oregon. For most of a century, the number of people who set foot in that cave in a given year could be counted on your hands. Here is the thing nobody puts in the visitor guide. Everything that makes Malheur Cave a perfect preservation environment also made it a perfect place to be forgotten. Continuous human use going back thousands of years, total physical preservation, and an ownership arrangement that meant almost nobody was ever going to look. That combination is close to unique in North America. And in 1938, one man did look. He got about as far as anyone ever has. And then he hit the water. The man was Luther Cressman. If you have never heard the name, that is not your fault. He is one of those figures who is enormous inside his field and invisible outside it. University of Oregon anthropologist. Spent decades working the caves of the Oregon high desert at a time when the standard model of American prehistory was short, tidy, and wrong. That same year, in a different Oregon cave, Cressman's team pulled sagebrush bark sandals out of a layer of volcanic ash. Sandals. Woven. Intact. They sat in a collection for over a decade until radiocarbon dating was invented, and when the sandals were finally run, the number came back around 9,000 years. That result helped detonate the accepted timeline for human presence in the West. Cressman spent a good part of his career being told he was wrong by people who turned out to be wrong. And in 1938, Cressman excavated Malheur Cave. He dug the dry floor. He recovered material. He documented what he could with the methods and the money available in the middle of the Depression, which was not much of either. And then he reached the water and the excavation ended, because the excavation had to end. You cannot dig underwater with a trowel and a screen in 1938. You cannot dig underwater with a trowel and a screen now. So the survey stopped at the shoreline. Everything past it, the deepest part of the sequence, the part protected by the coldest, stillest, most oxygen-poor water in the system, stayed exactly where it was. For 87 years. Now the water is going down. And here is where the story stops being about archaeology and starts being about something a lot more ordinary and a lot worse. The lake in Malheur Cave is not fed by a stream. It is not runoff. It is the water table. The cave is a window into the aquifer under the Harney Basin, and the level in that cave is the level in the rock. The Harney Basin aquifer is in trouble. This is not speculation, and it is not a theory. It is one of the most thoroughly documented groundwater declines in the state of Oregon. More water has been pulled out of that basin than goes into it, year after year. Irrigation wells across the valley, drawing on an aquifer that recharges slowly, in a place that gets a handful of inches of precipitation annually. State regulators have designated the area a groundwater area of concern and moved to restrict new wells. Studies have documented water levels falling by feet per year in parts of the basin. Ranch wells have gone dry. Households have gone dry. People in Harney County have had to drill deeper or haul water, and the arguments about it have been going on in that valley for years, in county meetings and at the state level, with everything you would expect when the resource under everyone's feet is finite and everyone's livelihood is sitting on top of it. That is the real story, not a drought. A drought ends. This is a withdrawal, and Malheur Cave sits in that same aquifer, holding a measuring stick nobody thought to read. As the regional water table drops, the cave lake drops with it. And the floor that Luther Cressman could not reach in 1938, the floor that has been under cold anoxic water continuously through the entire history of American archaeology, is coming into the air. The first things exposed are unremarkable. That is how these sites always start. Mineral staining where the old waterline sat for generations, a hard band on the rock like the ring in a bathtub, silt, cobbles, fragments of basalt off the ceiling. Then it stops being unremarkable. Because what emerges from under a preservation environment like that one is not fragments. It is sequence, layers, undisturbed, unmixed, uncontaminated sediment laid down in order, sealed by water, never plowed, never dug, never walked on. Archaeologists will tell you that finding an object is luck. Finding an intact sequence is everything. And a sequence is exactly what has been coming out of the dark at the back of Malheur Cave. If the idea of a room that has been sealed since before this country had a flag makes the back of your neck go cold, subscribe. This channel goes into the places the maps stop. Now, back to what is past that waterline. Picture being the one who walks it. You are 800, 900 feet into solid rock. The entrance light died a long way back. The air does not move. There is no breeze in a lava tube, because a lava tube has one door. The air in front of you has been sitting in that spot for a very long time. Sound behaves wrong. There is no wind noise, no insects, no distant anything. Your own breathing is the loudest thing in the county. The floor changes under your boots. Dry grit becomes damp grit becomes silt, and the silt is the color of wet cement and holds the print of your foot perfectly. Which is the first thing that stops you, because it means the last foot that stood there also left a print, and that print is somewhere under yours. Your light reaches maybe 40 feet. 40 feet is not far enough. Not in a passage that runs for another half-mile. You can see the old waterline on the wall beside you at chest height, a dark horizontal band running level into the dark ahead. That line is a clock face. Everything above it has been in the air, exposed, degrading slowly for however long. Everything below it has been in suspended animation. And you are standing below it, on the dry side of a line that was not dry. Here is the part that gets people. Your light finds something in the silt. One object. You look at it for a while and you tell yourself it is a rock. Because that is the honest first answer, and the field teaches you to give the honest first answer. Then you find the second one, and the second one is not a rock, because rocks do not have worked edges. Then you turn your head, and there is a third, and past the third the beam falls off into black, and you understand, in a way that no photograph will ever transmit, that you are not looking at three objects. You are looking at the near edge of a floor. The light only reaches so far. That is the whole psychology of a cave. You never see the extent of anything. You see the amount your lamp is willing to give you, and your brain fills the rest with whatever it has on hand. And what a floor like that gives up is not what people imagine. It is not gold, and it is not skulls. It is cordage, twisted plant fiber, still holding its twist, basketry fragments, worked stone with the flake scars sharp because nothing has ever tumbled them, charcoal from fires, bone from meals, woven material of the exact class that made Cressman famous, preserved by the exact conditions that make this cave what it is. Ordinary things. Ordinary things are the entire point. A spear point tells you someone passed through. A hearth, a sandal, a scrap of a basket, and the seeds of the meal that went in it tell you someone lived. And organic material is what carries a date. That is why this matters, and why the people who work these sites talk about the Oregon caves the way other people talk about a court case that could go either way. Because Oregon caves have a history of returning numbers that nobody wanted. For most of the 20th century, American archaeology ran on a single confident model. The story went like this. The first people to enter the Americas came across the Bering Land Bridge, came down through an ice-free corridor, and arrived around 13,000 years ago. We named them Clovis, after the fluted points found at Clovis, New Mexico. And for decades, Clovis first was not a hypothesis. It was the floor. Claim anything older and you were, professionally speaking, finished. Careers ended over this. Sites were dismissed. Researchers who reported older dates were told their samples were contaminated, their stratigraphy was disturbed, their methods were sloppy. Then the Oregon High Desert started producing numbers. At the Paisley Caves, a couple of hours west of Malheur in the same kind of country, a University of Oregon team, led by Dennis Jenkins, recovered material from dry cave sediment and ran it. Human material. Preserved by exactly the conditions we have been describing. Dry, sealed, stable, undisturbed. The dates came back older than Clovis, around 14,000 years. The findings were published in Science, and the fight that followed was as ugly as academic fights get. Contamination, critics said. Groundwater movement, they said. Rodents, they said. The Paisley team went back and answered every one of those objections with more data, and the site is now among the most cited pre-Clovis candidates in North America, alongside a growing set of others. The floor moved. What was heresy became one of the leading positions in the field. And it moved because of caves in eastern Oregon that preserved organic material well enough to date. Now hold that against Malheur. You have a sealed basalt tube with documented human use going back thousands of years in the same region, with preservation conditions at least as good as Paisley, and arguably better, containing a stratigraphic sequence that has been under cold anoxic water since before the discipline of archaeology existed, which is to say, a sequence that has never been touched by anyone in a position to get it wrong. Nobody has published what is in the deepest part of that sequence, not because it has been suppressed, because nobody has ever been able to reach it. And this is where it stops being an academic argument and lands somewhere closer to home. If you live in Harney County, the water table is not a diagram. It is the reason your well is or is not producing this year. It is the number on the report the state hands out at the meeting in Burns. It is the neighbor who drilled another 200 feet, and the neighbor who could not afford to. The same drawdown that is emptying wells across that valley is what is pulling the water back off that cave floor, which means the discovery and the crisis are the same event. You cannot have one without the other. The only reason anyone can stand on that ground is that the aquifer under a rural Oregon county is being spent faster than it is being refilled. And here is the cruelty of it. The instant that floor comes out of the water, it starts dying. Cold anoxic water is what held those fibers together for 10,000 years. Air is not neutral. Air brings oxygen, which brings oxidation. It brings drying, which cracks and crumbles organic material. It brings temperature swing, humidity swing, mold, spores, and every microbe that rides in on a person's clothing. The clock that stopped when the water covered it starts again the moment the water leaves. Not in a century. Immediately. Now we get to the part that unsettles people who work in this field, and it has nothing to do with a conspiracy. Malheur Cave is private property. That single fact governs everything. On federal land, an archaeological site carries legal machinery, survey requirements, permitting, consultation, mandatory reporting, public records. Somebody has to look, and somebody has to write it down, and the writing gets filed where the public can find it. On private land in the state of Oregon, most of that machinery does not engage the same way. Access is by permission. Reporting obligations are far thinner. There is no requirement that anyone survey anything, and no requirement that what is found be published. So ask a plain question. In the 87 years since Cressman, who has been in the deep passage of that cave, and what did they take note of? The honest answer is that there is no complete public record, and no institution is obligated to produce one. Then there is the Cressman material itself. Excavations from that era generated volume. Boxes of it. And the standard fate of Depression-era excavation material at American universities is not a museum case. It is a shelf. Bagged, tagged in the handwriting of a graduate student who has been dead for 40 years, cataloged to the standards of 1938, and in a great many cases never fully reanalyzed with any technique developed since. Radiocarbon dating did not exist when Cressman dug Malheur. It was invented afterward. The Fort Rock sandals sat in storage for over a decade before anyone could put a number on them, and the number rewrote a chapter. That is not a hypothetical for Malheur. That is the documented pattern of this exact researcher, at this exact site, in this exact decade. There is material from that cave in institutional storage in this state that has never been run with methods that have existed since the 1950s. And then there is the part that is not about paperwork at all. The Burns Paiute tribe are the descendants of the people whose ancestors used that cave. The oral tradition about what happened inside it is theirs. Under federal law, human remains and certain cultural items carry protections and consultation requirements, and tribes have every right to decide what is examined, what is disclosed, and what is left alone. Which means some of what is known about that cave is not going to be public, and should not be, and the people asking loudest are usually the people with the least claim to it. So when researchers who will happily talk for an hour about basalt and hydrology get brief and careful about the deep passage, it is not because there is a file being hidden. It is because there are things in this country where the right answer is that it is not yours to know. Let that land for a moment. Because the void in the record here is not a cover-up, it is worse, in a way. It is the ordinary result of a site being private, a discipline being underfunded, a collection being unfashionable, and a community being owed a say. Nobody had to bury anything. It was enough that nobody was required to look. So what do? Argument 1. You go now. The floor is exposed and it is degrading. Every month it sits in the air is a month of oxidation and desiccation on material that survived 10,000 years underwater. This is a one-time opening. A sequence like that, in a preservation environment like that, in a region actively rewriting the peopling of the continent, is not a research opportunity. It is a witness that is dying while you argue about whether to take the statement. And there is a harder version of that argument. Exposed floors attract people. Rural, remote, unmonitored sites in the American West get looted, routinely, and looting does not just steal objects. It destroys the layer, which is the only thing that makes the objects mean anything. Once someone has dug a hole in that silt for a point to sell, the sequence around it is gone permanently. Argument 2. You leave it. Excavation is destruction. That is not a slogan. It is the literal method. You take a site apart to read it, and you cannot put it back. Every generation of archaeologists has looked at what the previous generation dug and winced, because the techniques improved, and the evidence was already spent. Residue analysis, sediment DNA, dating precision that did not exist 20 years ago. All of it recovered information from soil that earlier excavators shoveled out as dirt. Whatever technique is going to exist in 2075 does not exist now, and it will not get to run on anything you dig up in 2026. And that is before you get to whose decision it is. The descendant community has standing here. And if the answer from Burns is that the deep passage stays undisturbed, that is not an obstacle to the research. That is the research question being answered by the people entitled to answer it. But hold both arguments up against the hydrology, because the hydrology does not care which one wins. The old assumption behind leave it in place was that the water would come back. Wet cycle returns, the aquifer recovers, the lake rises, the floor reseals, and the site waits for better tools. That assumption depends on recharge. An overdrafted aquifer in an arid basin does not restore itself on a human schedule. If withdrawal keeps outrunning recharge in the Harney Basin, the water does not return to that cave in a decade. The floor stays in the air, drying, for the whole span of the argument. So the choice is not between digging and waiting. It is between recovering a damaged record now and watching an intact one dry out on a shelf of basalt while everyone involved does the responsible thing. There is no clean answer here. There is only which loss you are willing to sign for. Here is how this ends, and it depends entirely on a number that has nothing to do with archaeology. If the Harney Basin aquifer stabilizes, if the restrictions hold, if the wet years come, if the withdrawals come down to something the rock can sustain, then the water table rises, and the lake at the back of Malheur Cave rises with it. The exposed floor goes back under. The cold returns. The oxygen leaves. And the clock stops again, mid-tick, with whatever remains preserved for as long as it stays there. That would be the good outcome. Understand what the good outcome actually is. A rural county gets its water back, and the most important archaeological floor in eastern Oregon disappears under it again for another century. If the aquifer does not stabilize, the water keeps dropping. More floor comes into the air every year. More of the deepest, oldest, best-preserved sequence in the region gets handed over to oxygen, and the ranch wells keep going dry, and the meetings in Burns keep getting louder. Both of those outcomes are already in motion. Neither of them can be undone by knowing about it. But what is known now cannot be unknown. The water level is measured. The aquifer decline is documented in state reports, in well logs, in the public record. The cave is on the map. The property line is on file. The 1938 excavation notes exist, and the material from that dig is sitting in institutional storage in Oregon right now, with dates on it that nobody has run. None of that goes back in the box. Every photograph you have ever seen of the Oregon high desert is accurate. The sagebrush really does run to the horizon. The sky really is that big. Steens Mountain really does come up out of the flat like something that does not belong there, and the light in the evening across the Harney Basin is as good as light gets in this country. All of it is true. The picture just stops at the surface, and what is underneath it, the water that is leaving, and the floor that water has been guarding since before there was a word for any of this, is the only part of the frame that is still changing. So here is what I want to know from you. If it were your call, and you knew the water might never come back, do you go in now and dig it, knowing that whatever you recover you also destroy, and that the tools to read it properly are still 40 years out? Or do you leave it, respect the decision of the people whose ancestors are in that ground, and accept that it may simply dry out while you wait? There is no third option. Tell me which loss you would sign for, down in the comments. I read all of them. And if this one got under your skin, The video coming up next is about a place a few hundred miles from here where the water did come back, and what it covered up on the way in. Watch that one before the level changes again.